next probably an hour, maybe a little bit longer, we're going to talk about Tolkien and his essay on fairy stories. Okay. Tolkien did this essay. It was first delivered as an address in around 1939 at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. They have an annual lecture, the Andrew Lang lecture, and Tolkien was asked to deliver this, not because Tolkien was a noted scholar of fairy stories or fairy tales or fantasy literature. It's because he'd written a fairy story, The Hobbit, published in 1937. When The Hobbit was published, it was published to international acclaim. I mean, it was regarded almost immediately as, a classic fairy story. But there aren't any fairies in The Hobbit. That is, there aren't any what people would kind of popularly call fairies. Little people with wings and flowering, none of them. So Tolkien gets invited to do this essay, to do this lecture, and he prepares for it. He goes through multiple drafts in preparation. You can see the drafts of the essay at the Bodleian Library. I can show you what some of them look like. I was working on a thing on the essay at one point several years ago, so I was transcribing it. And he's got, scraps of paper, he has stuff written like this, and he turns it, and he's writing here, and then he's writing in between the lines with a different color ink or different color pencil, all kinds of weird stuff. So what he does eventually is he says to his audience, I don't really know anything about fairy stories, but I couldn't really come up here and say I don't really know anything about fairy stories, take the check and leave. So I need to come up with something. So he posits these three questions. What is a fairy story? What are their origins? And what is the use of them? And in the beginning part of the essay, first third maybe, he talks about what is a fairy story. And he finally comes down with this answer. Can't be defined. In other words, you can't say what is a fairy story. What you can do is you can say what a fairy story is not. And that's all he really does. He says, stories that have talking animals, those aren't fairy stories. Those are traditionally what are called beast fables. Okay? Why can't it be defined? Because there is an elusive quality about fairy stories that makes them undefinable. You have to understand what the word define literally means. It means to put a boundary around. It means to put a limit around it. And what Tolkien wants us to understand is you can't do that because of how fairy stories actually work, or because of really this third question. So he says they can't be defined. All I can do is I can tell you a fairy story when I see one. In other words, they have to be experienced, right? So he says, let's go on to the second question. What are their origins? How do fairy stories begin? And he ultimately says, it doesn't matter. Why doesn't it matter? Other than Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, if you can, give me an example of a modern fairy story. Either one written or one in another medium, like film or television. Anybody have an example? Yes?
The Daughter of Smoke and Bone series.
Okay, not familiar with it. What's it about?
It's about kind of like there's two different things. It's like seraphs and these beasts.
Okay.
And they're at war, kind of like in Harry Potter, like they're fighting each other for land.
Okay.
And there's a certain girl who is remade into a human, like they put her out so she could live, and she has to work to get from Earth to their pretty much about the war and how they come to win and everything.
Okay. You had one?
Yeah, I was thinking like Cinderella.
Cinderella, okay, it's not modern. It's pretty old, actually, at least 500 years old, but Cinderella is very much one. How about Star Wars? Not this stupid 21st century garbage. The original, 1977, 1980, 1983. Or just any single one of those. Here's another one. How about film-wise? Any of the Spider-Man films. Okay. How's Star Wars? How's it a fairy story? Yes.
It has forces beyond our understanding and takes place in a completely separate universe.
Okay. That takes place in a completely separate universe. That's very important to what Tolkien is talking about in here. It is the secondary world or the other world. Okay. Forces beyond our understanding. That kind of fits this part, arresting strangeness. Okay. You familiar with the scene in the first one when Luke and Han Solo, they're in the one room in the Millennium Falcon, and Luke is undergoing his training. Okay. He's got his lightsaber. Obi-Wan hasn't put on the blast shield. What does Han Solo say? Anybody remember? Hokey religions and something like, old weapons are no match for a good blaster. Right? And yet, what happens at the end of the film? It's the hokey religion that enables Luke to. Okay? Yeah, he uses a blaster of sorts, but what does he do before then? Before he destroys the Death Star? Luke, you've turned off your sighting computer. Yeah, I know. It's okay. Well, everybody else back on the other starships are going, no, it really isn't okay. You're going to miss this thing. The target's like this big. You're going to miss it if you don't have on that targeting computer. No. It's okay. Trust me. Their whole reality depends upon kind of him hitting that. Okay? That's fairy story. That's fantasy. It's not science fiction. It's the complete opposite of Star Trek. Where does, always, more so in the TV series than in the film, but where does the answer usually come in Star Trek? What provides the solution? Technology. In Star Wars, where does the solution usually come from? It comes from inside. It's not something outside. Whether the force is the force within or it's the larger force outside. Okay? So, what are the origins of Star Wars? How did George Lucas come up with that? Well, he read a lot of Eastern religion, into Buddhism and such. Very familiar also with Christianity, because there are very strong Christian elements. What else? He was a huge fan of Tolkien and other works of fantasy literature. Yeah, but can you take the original Star Wars film and take all these little influences and pull them out? Yeah, you could. What would you end up with? The film? No. You'd end up with all these little snippets of influence. Okay? That would just be kind of lying there on the screening room floor. Individually, what makes them into Star Wars? Having it all put together. How? In the mind of the author. Okay? So Tolkien uses an image in talking about origins of somebody making a soup. He refers to the cauldron of soup. Okay? And he says stories are like soup or stew. You get a big cauldron and you pour in water, and then what else do you put in to make a soup or a stew? Anybody? Vegetables. Okay, vegetables is a blanket term. So potato, maybe carrot, maybe onion, and a few others. What else do you put in? You might throw in meat. Again, a blanket term. So you might throw in steak or roast or chicken or pork or specific kind. What else do you put in? Spices. Again, blanket term, so you might put in individual particular spices and herbs, etc. And then you put all the stuff in a bucket of water, and then you just start eating it right then, right? You have to cook it, which means it has to do what? It's got to sit there and simmer. Because what happens to the vegetables and the meat and the spices? Yeah, they soften, they congeal, they break down, they mix in and out of each other. If I were to invite you over to my house and say, we're having stew tonight, and you walked in and I had a table laid out like this, and I had a chunk of meat, and a carrot, and a potato, and a dab of salt, and some pepper, and a bunch of spices, and a cup of water, and say, enjoy your stew, what would you think? This person's utterly crazy. That's not stew. What is that? Those are ingredients, okay? Fairy stories work the same way. You pull the individual elements out, what do you have? Ingredients. You don't have the story. In another essay, the one on the Old English poem Beowulf, Tolkien talks about people who want to take Beowulf and take it apart to figure out what the origins of the story are. And he says, they're missing the whole point. They see the story and they think of it as a mine, to be mined. So you go in and you dig around and you pull out all the really good, valuable stuff. And what are you left with? A big hole in the ground. Rather than seeing it as a work of art. Gandalf is going to say, in a passage we'll talk about, something to the effect of, he's talking with Saruman. And Saruman says, haven't you noticed my new coat? He had been Saruman the White, now he calls himself Saruman of many colors. Gandalf says, I liked white better. Saruman says, psh, white. The white page can be overwritten. The white cloth can be dyed. The white light can be broken. By which he means, what can you do with white light if you have a prism? You refract it, you divide it, you break it down into what? The various colors of the spectrum. Okay? And Gandalf says, when Saruman says, the white light can be broken, he that would break a thing to see what it is has left the path of wisdom. He that would break a thing, a fairy story, take it all apart to see what it is, has left the path of wisdom. Why? Because you're no longer talking about a work of art, a fairy story. So he ultimately says, it doesn't matter what their origins are. What matters is, what's the use of them now? Now, Tolkien doesn't say it's not interesting to try to figure out the origins, like the Lord of the Rings. A lot of people have spent years trying to figure out what are Tolkien's sources. Well, we know what a lot of his sources are. He has sources in Old Norse poetry. He has sources in various Germanic branches, the poetry of the various Germanic branches, okay, from Old English, from Middle English, from Gothic. He's got sources, elements from Welsh, sources and elements from Finnish, okay? Whole slew of them. But you pull all of those out, and what are you left with? Just the ingredients. For example, does it really add anything to our understanding of the character of Gandalf to know that his name comes from an Old Norse document and it's referring to a dwarf? No. Doesn't tell us anything about Gandalf, other than that his name was actually the name of a dwarf. Okay. Doesn't add to his character, doesn't tell us anything about his persona, about his power, about where he comes from, etc. Okay? So, Tolkien says, this is what's important. Yeah, invisible rings are cool. And there's a reason why. We have stories going back a couple of thousand years at least, all the way up to today, where there are still things that confer invisibility. So part of what he does here is he says, what we're really asking is, why are there these elements that continue on? Why does J.K. Rowling have a cloak of invisibility? Why does The Lord of the Rings have a ring that confers invisibility? What is it about invisibility that intrigues humanity? Yeah, You've got a film, The Invisible Man. Ralph Ellison wrote a book, The Invisible Man. He means it entirely differently than it usually does. Okay? But what is it? Why do we want invisibility? Why do we want to be able to fly? I don't mean in an airplane. I mean people would like to be able to fly just with this. Why do some people really wish they could learn the language of nature? Let's say trees. Assume for a moment trees could speak. Literally, they could speak. What tree would you want to talk to? Some tree that's 5 years old? Or would you want to go off to California to go to the Great Redwoods? I'm from California. I used to go camping, backpacking, Great Redwoods. Trees that have been around for 2,000 years. What could they tell you? How many of you have pets? Yeah. Wouldn't you want to know what your dog or cat thinks if you have a dog or cat? Sorry, goldfish probably don't think. Okay. A bird if you have a bird. So one of the things Tolkien's getting at here is we have this desire to speak to things not ourselves. Why? I mean, it drove somebody, a brilliant scientist like Carl Sagan. He had to know we're not alone in the universe. He believed with every fiber of his being humanity isn't the only intelligent life in the universe. Why? Because he couldn't stand the thought of being alone, of us being it. Okay? That's a religious faith, folks. It might not be the religion of the Bible or Quran or some other holy text, but it is a faith kind of system. So, Tolkien says, what's the use of fairy stories now? Now. 1939 or 2016. Why do we read fairy stories today? Why do we enjoy fairy stories? Whether on the written page or on the screen. Why is it, of the top 10 grossing films of all time, why is it like at least 5 or 6 of them are essentially fairy stories? I mean, the Lord of the Rings films are based on the Lord of the Rings. Okay? The Harry Potter films are based on Harry Potter. But what else? Spider-Man, the original one, was a huge box office success in 2001. Okay? The Avenger films, is it just because they're comics brought to life? No. Captain America is nothing about comics. Captain America is fairy story. He is purely fantasy. Why? Name someone who's really Steve Rogers. I actually know a guy named Steve Rogers, but he's not Captain America. Okay? Are there really people that wonderful? It's hard to believe. Okay? Though you read about Chris Evans, and man, he's pretty much living up to the hype. Disgusting. So, what's the use of them today? Why should we read them? We, us, adults. Okay? He has a big section on children in fairy stories. Why? Because we tend to think, fairy stories. I'm in college. What are we doing talking about fairy stories? Fairy stories are for kids. They're for children. I teach a course in London almost every other summer called The Appeal of Harry Potter. When people, meaning adults, find out I'm teaching it, whether I'm over there and I'm speaking to somebody, and they ask, what are you doing over here? And I say, I'm teaching a course on Harry Potter. They look at me like I'm crazy. Like, really? You must be kind of special. Why? Because Harry Potter is what? Fantasy? Louder? Fictional? It's childish. It's a kid's book. Hell no. Maybe the first book, maybe the first 3 books when they came out were kids' books. Book 4? That is not a kid's book. Books 6 and 7? No. Those are for us. And I say us even more, me at nearly 55, than you guys at at 20, 21, 22, that area. Okay? So Tolkien has a big long section about children. Why do we assume fairy stories are for children?
Because they're magical, their imagination and creativity. And as adults, we kind of lose that side of our childhood.
Because children are gullible. They easily believe things. You can tell a 5-year-old the wildest lie, and their eyes will get really big and they'll believe it. Does that mean you should tell 5-year-olds the wildest lies in the world? No, it doesn't. Okay? But as we become older, we develop rational faculties that enable us to sift things, to discriminate. Discrimination's a good word. Okay? We kind of use it today like it's always bad. It's not. It's good. It means to be able to tell the difference between things. And we usually can tell the difference between when somebody's BSing us and when they're not BSing us. Okay? So he talks about children and this natural, childlike capacity they have for belief. We tend to get older and we tend to lose that natural, childlike capacity. Okay? That's not necessarily a good thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing either, though it can be. Okay? So, he says, just before the section beginning with fantasy, he's talking about children and how fantasy stories have become relegated to children. And he uses this image of old furniture. And he says, we've given the fairy stories to children like we give them old furniture. We take the furniture out of the main rooms of the house and we put it up in the nursery. Why? What can they do to it? Utterly destroy it, because we don't care about it anymore. So he's kind of, by analogy, saying, we adults, we don't care about these stories anymore, so we give them to children to let them do whatever they want with them. Okay? So, he says in the third paragraph before fantasy, if we use child in a good sense, it also has legitimately a bad one, as in, don't be childish. In other words, act your age. We must not allow that to push us into the sentimentality of only using adult or grown-up in a bad sense. It also has a good one. What does he mean of only using adult or grown-up in a bad sense? Have any of you seen Stranger Things? Netflix? Okay. I won't spoil it. You need to watch it. It's one of the Netflix is doing the best stuff. Okay, you need to watch it. 7 or 8 episodes. They're not very long, 45, 50 minutes. Okay, but one of the things that you see in that is you do largely get a portrayal of adults or grown-ups in kind of this bad sense. I'm going to really qualify this. In the sense that they don't believe. Okay? There's some weird stuff that happens, and the kids all understand what's going on, or at least the ones involved do. But the adults don't believe them. Why? Because they're kids. And they're kids in 1983 playing Dungeons and Dragons. In other words, they're losers and weirdos, right? As even their classmates call them. What else? How many of you have seen, what's that stupid Spielberg film? E.T. The original E.T., the unedited, unrevised E.T. Well, in the original one, Spielberg portrays adults, with one exception, as all being really evil. The one exception is Elliot's mom. Right? All the other adults, they're kind of portrayed the way the old Charlie Brown cartoons portrayed adults, where you see them from the waist down and you hear wah, 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 wah. Right? In the original E.T., when the men in black came to get E.T., they came armed, carrying rifles and weapons. When Spielberg re-edited it, they're not carrying weapons and rifles anymore. They're carrying things much more fearsome. Clipboards. Ooh. Why? Because Spielberg's an anti-gun nut. So he had to take those images out. But the children in the films, they're portrayed as nothing but little angels. Like they would never do anything wrong. Everybody in this room knows that's not the case. Not all little children are angels. Some of them are little SOBs. Okay? I've got 4 kids. None of them are little children. So, he says the process of growing older is not necessarily allied to growing wickeder, though the two do often happen together. Okay, notice that. The process of growing older is not necessarily allied to growing wickeder. That is, just because you get older doesn't mean you get worse as a person, though that often happens. Children are meant to grow up and not to become Peter Pans. What does he mean? What is Peter Pan's problem? He never grows up. He's a child. Why? Why doesn't he grow up?
He's pulling pranks his entire life.
He doesn't allow himself.
He doesn't allow himself. He refuses to grow up. Why? He wants to stay 12 years old. What kind of cares and concerns does a 12-year-old have, especially if you're living in Neverland? I mean, you got Hook to deal with, but you can fly and Hook can't. That's not really much of a problem. Okay? But what about the other children? The lost boys. Do they want never to grow up? No, they do want to grow up. Because what do they want? Mothers and fathers. They want to go through the normal process of aging. Not to lose innocence and wonder. That is, children are meant to grow up. Skip the part about Peter Pan. Not to lose innocence and wonder, but to proceed on the appointed journey. What's the appointed journey? Life. Growing up. But notice what Tolkien says. It doesn't mean you have to lose innocence and wonder. It doesn't mean you have to get old and jaded and skeptical and pessimistic. Okay? But to proceed on the appointed journey. What journey? That journey upon which it is certainly not better to travel, hopefully, than to arrive. Though we must travel, hopefully, if we are to arrive. Notice it's kind of punning, it's playing on words. That journey upon which it is certainly not better to travel, hopefully, than to arrive. What's the journey? Life. What's the destination? Death. Death. Okay? And he says, to arrive at that destination, we have to travel what? Hopefully. That means, literally, full of hope. If you don't have hope, you have the opposite. What's the opposite of hope? Despair. Okay? So, it's one of the lessons of fairy stories, if we can speak of the lessons of things that do not lecture, that on callow, lumpish, and selfish youth, peril, sorrow, and the shadow of death can bestow dignity and even sometimes wisdom. Man, and I never thought about it. I watched Stranger Things over about the last week and a half. That's an accurate description right there of what happens to the little kids. Okay? Callow, lumpish, selfish. They don't care about anything else. They care about themselves, the 4 main boys. They care about themselves in their Dungeons and Dragons game. Until something happens to their little world. What something? Peril, sorrow, and the shadow of death bestows on them dignity, okay? And even sometimes wisdom. So, Tolkien goes on. Very well then. If adults are to read fairy stories as a natural branch of literature, neither playing at being children, that is, not reading them because they're pretending to be children, okay, nor pretending to be choosing for children, that is, nor reading these fairy stories because some adult will think, well, that's kind of weird. Oh, well, I'm doing it because I need to check what my children are reading. Or, as I once put it, I went to a doctor. I was working on my PhD, and my wife was pregnant with our first child, and so I was kind of getting ready for our child to be born, and I was reading the collected Winnie the Pooh. And so I'm sitting there in the doctor's office, and she comes in and she goes, Winnie the Pooh? Well, yeah, because my wife's about to have a baby. I was too ashamed to say, yeah, you ought to read it. Maybe you'll learn something. Everybody should read Winnie the Pooh because they'll learn a lot. Nor pretend to be choosing for children, nor being boys who would not grow up. So, what are the values and functions of this time? He changes this question to, what are the values and functions of fairy stories? Notice, what's the use of them? To, what's their value? And what's their function, their purpose? Okay? And he says, fairy stories offer in a peculiar degree or mode these four things: fantasy, escape, recovery, and consolation. Okay? Fantasy ultimately defines it as arresting strangeness. Fairy stories, in order to be fairy stories, they've got to shake you out of your regular existence. That's why if you were, I'll use myself as an example, 15 in 1977, and you waited 3 months to get in to see Star Wars because tickets were sold out. This was in San Jose, California, which is at the time, the #1 movie ticket sale place in the country. Even higher than Hollywood. Why? Because we had more people than Hollywood. Not more people than LA, but more than Hollywood. And it was 3 months before I could get in. But you're in there, you're 15, and the first thing you see are these letters coming up from the bottom of the screen and disappearing. You're immediately going, what in the world? I've never seen anything like this. And then they have this giant Star Destroyer come in from the top of the screen and go over. And to have black marks on it, to be dirty. It's not like Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, where the spaceships are pristine, like they've just come off the assembly line. Okay? That's arresting strangeness. You immediately know you're not in Kansas anymore. Okay? So, fantasy. He also talks a lot about fantasy, about its relation to imagination and such, about how it's best expressed. Tolkien does not think this thing is good for expressing fantasy or plays. Okay? He thinks the written word is the best. And there's something he doesn't talk about, but there's one really good reason for that. Anybody, give me an example of a book you've read that you've then seen turned into a film, and the film doesn't match your image of the book. Aragon.
It sucked.
Okay.
The Giver.
The Giver.
Harry Potter.
Hobbit.
Yeah, Radagast the Brown with his horse, with his rabbits and sled, the pot.
It was a good movie if you never read the book, but compared to the book, it was nothing.
That's the problem with a lot of movies based on films, though.
You
The
can't-
movie itself, standalone, the movie is really
Yeah.
great. But if you're someone who's read the book, you're
Yeah.
sitting there like pulling your hair out watching it.
Well,
Okay.
when you're watching it, you're like, oh, well, they left this out.
Okay,
You can't
let me ask
concentrate.
this. Are there books that you've seen turned into films where the film is faithful to the book?
Yeah, the Maze Runner was really great.
Maze Runner, okay, I've not seen that.
Fight Club.
Okay. Holes?
Oh,
Yeah.
Holes is a very good rendition. I would even say most of the Hunger Games films are really very close. Okay? Meaning they don't change the structure. They don't change characters. Okay? Gale is pretty much the same Gale as he is in the books. Okay? As are the other characters. Lord of the Rings, they take Faramir and they turn his character 180 degrees. They take Sam's character, turn him 180 degrees. Okay? Completely opposite of what is in the books. So Tolkien says, this kind of literature, fantasy, is best left for written. Why? Because each of us then becomes the director. And we become the person who chooses the casting. For example, I have a certain actor in mind. When I read The Lord of the Rings, I see this person as Gandalf. And I have another one that I see as Aragorn. I do not see Elijah Wood as Frodo. He looks like a frog. Pointy eyes and everything. The actor I see as Gandalf is not one who's actually played Gandalf in a film. He did the voice of Gandalf in the BBC 13-part audio version. The actor named Michael Hordern. He was a Shakespearean actor. Okay? But he has this voice that when I read Lord of the Rings, I hear his voice. I don't see him because I've only seen him in one thing. I do see Ian McKellen. Ian McKellen was fabulously cast. Okay? Aragorn, I see Sam Elliott. If you're not familiar with who Sam Elliott is, look him up. Okay? Tall, lanky, he's older now. Deep, gravelly voice. I don't see Viggo Mortensen. Why? He's too pretty. Aragorn's not pretty. He's rugged. He's ruggedly handsome. That is, you got to clean him up quite a bit. Viggo Mortensen could be rolling around in mud and get up. He'd still be pretty. No other way to put it. Okay? So, Tolkien goes on and talks about how fantasy ultimately is produced. And he talks about the imagination. He talks about working from the imagination up here into the world out here. Every one of you is going to do this semester. You're not going to do it in a work of creative genius. You're going to do it in a work of sheer drudgery when you write your term papers. Because you're not going to turn that term paper and go, I'm going to find a publisher for this because this is going to make me $1 bazillion. What do I mean? You're going to know up here what you mean. And up here, how good will it be? Come on, be honest. Perfect. It'll be perfect up here. And then it comes to my hands. How will it be? How does it get from here to my hands? What do you have to do? Okay? You have to write it. That is, you start with the idea, the imagination as Tolkien calls it. And then what do? You work. You work. You produce a technique that gets from up here to down here. See, you have these things that it has to get through. Okay? Meaning you have to translate it from the idea up here into words down here. And I don't know about you, but there's a problem in translation between up here to down here on my part. What comes out here is never what I envision up here. It's never perfect. Okay? But that's the art part. So you start with the image, the imagination, the idea. The art is the producing of it. The final product, that's what Tolkien will call the secondary world. That's Middle Earth. That's the capital and the 13 districts. Okay? Whether or not it works is whether or not everything that is finally, ultimately produced, the secondary world, whether it's true to itself. That is, whether or not the laws that the author creates in that world are upheld. Okay? Whether it follows the rules of its own world. The Lord of the Rings does. Nobody that I'm aware of has pointed out an inherent flaw in the Lord of the Rings. For example, an anachronism. Something that doesn't belong. Tolkien did, for example, in C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. He couldn't stand the Chronicles of Narnia. Because in the very first book, Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, the original very first book, Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, what's the glaring, how many of you are familiar with that, by the way? Only a few of you. What's the huge glaring problem? What does not belong in Narnia that Lewis puts in Narnia? The children are on their way to the stone table. Who do they meet? He gives them things. Santa. Father Christmas. What the hell? What is Father Christmas doing in Narnia? There is no Christmas in Narnia. Jesus hasn't lived and died in Narnia. Tolkien was like, Jack, what are you doing? Doesn't belong. Lewis is like, yeah, I'm just pulling images from left and right. No. You can't do that. Doesn't work that way. So you don't have a Father Christmas kind of character in The Lord of the Rings. Not at all. Okay? You don't have kind of physical laws that are created within the novel that are then violated. You're going to see when we do Harry Potter, there are all kinds of problems in the Harry Potter novels. I mean, writing problems, factual problems within them that should make your mind go when you come to them. Here's one, for example. Book 4. I'm trying to do this without giving too much away. In Book 4, a person dies. And when the person dies, he is 6 feet away from another character. And then 2 paragraphs later, he's suddenly 20 feet away. But the dead person hasn't moved. And the person that he fell next to also has not moved. So he dies, falls down 6 feet beside him. And the next time he's referred to, he's 20 feet away. There is no way to explain that. None. That's bad writing. That's even worse, copy editing. The copy editor should have said, Joe, we got a problem here. What do you want to do? Do you want to make it that he falls 20 feet away and he stays 20 feet away? Or do you want to make it that he falls 6 feet away and he stays 6 feet away? Yes?
My mom was talking to me about book 7 the other day, and she was saying that there's a bunch of continuity issues with characters switching sides, in the final battle and stuff like that. Slughorn, I think, switches sides twice or something like that.
No, he doesn't actually switch sides, even though he's Slytherin. He does.
Or he's referred to on accident with the wrong people.
Yeah, that might be. Yeah, I mean there are things like that. Okay, that's probably because she did not spend the amount of time that Tolkien spent on The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien started The Lord of the Rings shortly after he wrote this essay, about 1939. He didn't publish it until 1954, the first volume. Okay? J.K. Rowling wrote all 7 books within a span of 10 years. Okay? And by the time the 7th book came out, her publisher was so breathing down her neck, her readers were so breathing down her neck, okay, that she was pressed for time. Okay? Yes?
This could very possibly just be speculation, and it's probably the error in the editing, but could it possibly be the character's perception of distance?
No.
Okay.
No, you'll see when we get there. I mean, it's so clear that there's just this kind of huge factual error. And that's not the only one. There are several others that refer to wizarding laws and such within the Harry Potter universe that we come to find out in later books, and then we see things in earlier books like, wait a second, but so-and-so does this in book 2, and then we find out in book 5 they're not supposed to be able to do that. She should have known by book 5 what she'd written in book 2. Okay? Things like that. Okay, so that's all part of fantasy. So the final product is this secondary world. Why is that important? Because it's that thing that we as readers enter when you read a work of fantasy. Have you ever been so involved in a book you kind of lose track of what's going on around you? Somebody tries to talk to you and they're like, hello, hello, and they can't get your attention. Why? Because you're not here anymore. You are in Middle Earth. You're running with Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli after Merry and Pippin, trying to rescue them from the orcs. Or you are with Katniss as she's making the final assault, on the capital or something like that. Okay? They created that little world. You're now in it. Another way to look at it is that you take your mind and you reformat your brain. And you take a little part just for, the fantasy literature. And you go off into there while you're reading it. Okay? So, that's fantasy. Recovery, escape, and consolation. I'll get these two out of order. What does he mean by recovery? He means fairy stories. Okay? Provide for us a way of cleaning these things. Every one of us looks through a pair of lenses. They're called our eyes. But the problem is our eyes and our vision gets dirty over time. We accumulate things so that we don't actually see them the way they ought to be seen. Or we don't see them how they really are. What do I mean? We accumulate things. Friends, family, loved ones. Okay? My wife and I have been married 31 years. When I look at my wife today, I don't look at her like I did 6 months after we were married. Why? I've known her for 32 years now, longer than that. So what does that mean? I hate to say it, but it kind of means she's like my wallet. What do I mean by that? Oh, she's heard this before. It means I know her so well, it's like she's just become a part of me. I own her in that sense. I possess her. Rather than, as Tolkien says, seeing her is totally separate, totally distinct from me. He says we appropriate things because they become familiar with us or familiar to us. What kinds of things? Everything. Everything. You walk into this classroom and you sit down at a desk without seeing anything else. What do I mean by anything else? The walls, the ceiling. Okay? Yeah, you see walls and ceiling, but you don't see walls made out of cement block that have a texture to them and that have mortar between them. You don't see a ceiling made out of this god-awful drop ceiling, stuff with, again, a texture, a pattern to it. Why? Because it's unimportant, right? Does your life really depend on that? No, it doesn't. Does your life really depend on the concrete cement block? Could be if some crazy, shooter comes in from outside and the door is locked. Because if this were paper, we'd all be dead. Right? What else? Trees. We kind of think we're like Ronald Reagan. You seen one tree, you seen them all. And I love Reagan, by the way, but I still use that. What do I mean? We don't see trees as separate, individual what? Living, breathing things. We don't see them for the glory that they have, or flowers, or grass, or animals. Why? We just see stuff that we see every day. So we don't pay any attention to it. Tolkien's point about recovery is that what fairy stories and fantasy do is they help us to kind of pay attention to those little things. And to see those little things, again, separate from ourselves. So what do those little things also include? Our friends, our loved ones. God forbid this should happen. But what happens if today you leave class and you find out a very close friend of yours has died? What do you think about maybe the last time you saw that person? maybe you didn't leave on the best of terms, you are immediately racked with guilt. Why? Because it didn't have to be that way. That's what he's getting at with recovery. Seeing everybody, okay, as if you're seeing them for the first time. Seeing everything as if you're seeing it for the first time. You want an example? Get on YouTube. Do a search for blind person seeing. And you can see multiple examples of this. And there's some really wonderful ones of these married couples. And this guy who's been blind all his life, and he sees his wife for the first time. I get chill bumps every time I think of this. He's never seen her before, other than with his hands or with his body against hers. But he sees her, and he just breaks down into tears. Or somebody who's never heard, and they get a cochlear implant, and they now hear. And what they hear is their daughter singing. And just pile of tears. Okay? That's what he's getting at with recovery. We need to learn to see like that again. That's what he means by seeing as we were meant to see things. Okay? Rather than seeing everything as somehow related to me. That's what I meant when I said, my wife's like my walk. I see her simply in relation to me, not as Karen Wolpert, totally separate, totally other. Okay? That's recovery. Escape. So, this is why fantasy literature, Harry Potter, etc., is often looked down upon, even in departments of English. Okay? Because it's called, it's just escapism. It's escapist. What's the matter? You can't deal with reality. You need to go off to your little la-la land, your Neverland. Tolkien draws a distinction between what he calls the flight of the prisoner versus the flight of the deserter. What's the difference between a prisoner and a deserter?
What is
The prisoner is trapped.
Okay? What about the deserter?
he's voluntary.
They leave willingly.
Okay? The deserter leaves willingly. What's the difference in status between a prisoner and a deserter? Prisoner is somebody being held against their will, right? Now, you can be a lawful prisoner. You can be arrested, put in jail. You can be in a prison in that sense. And maybe you're there justifiably. But you can also be an unlawful prisoner. Like a prisoner of war. It's prisoner of war's duty, used to be at least, to escape. In World War II, every American serviceman was told, if you are captured, it is your duty to attempt to escape. Okay? Why? Because you don't owe anything to the Germans or the Japanese or the Italians. It's your job to try to get back home. Okay? So, that's the prisoner trying to escape from the reality he or she has been thrust into. It's not that the reality they recognize. The deserter, however, is different. What's the person who is deserting doing?
They're just dropping
Okay? They're going, la, 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 I don't hear you. They're saying, it's not my responsibility, but it is their responsibility. The deserter is usually, again, it's a military analogy. A soldier who is doing what?
Even for responsibility.
Running from his job. He has a duty to do and is saying, no, I'm not going to do that. Okay? So, Tolkien says the escape that we find in fantasy literature is this. It's not this. How so? What's the distinction? Did you get to choose the family you were born into? Did you get to choose the socioeconomic class you were born into? Did you get to choose the wealth your family has? Probably not. You probably had no choice at all in that matter. Did you get to choose whether or not you were born in the United States or Namibia? or the United States or Mexico? No. Does that affect how you live life? Yes, it does. Everyone, I don't care if you're at the highest level of the spectrum or the lowest level of the spectrum, everyone born in America has privileges that people born in other parts of the world do not have and will never have. Even if they're born dirt poor in America. What's one of those privileges? You're an American. Just that in and of itself means certain things that somebody born, in North Korea will never experience. Okay? So, escape? Hell, yes. How many of you, your life today, right now, well, not right this minute, because I know you're all pouring in tears, but after this class, your life is just going wonderfully. It couldn't be better. Yeah, that's kind of what I thought. Okay? So what does that mean? That means you want to escape. And you probably do escape. How do you do your escapes? Well, some people do it this way. Some people pop pills. Some people are sex addicts. Some people do it with this. Some people do it with this. What are you doing with each of those? You're trying to escape from your reality. You're trying to say, no, you're distracting yourself. From what? Your poor, rotten, sorry, sucky life. Okay? 17th century philosopher said, human lives are poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Pretty downer perspective. Okay? So, we need this escape, Tolkien says. But it's not just that kind of thing. He says there are other things we want to escape from. We want to escape from, for example, let's just jump to the biggie. What are the two inevitable things of life? Death and taxes. We'll probably be able to escape death before we will taxes. Okay? Death and taxes. Okay? What's the basis behind the multi-billion-dollar plastic surgery industry? It's, I want to defy age. Doesn't work, does it? Look at the quote-unquote celebrities in their 60s and 70s and 80s who have done too much plastic surgery, and they no longer look like people. They look like mannequins. Slightly twisted, weird mannequins, but mannequins nevertheless. Why do they do that? Because they're trying to stop time. We can't stop time. Okay? What else? What else would we like to escape from? What are some problems in American society right now? Don't get into politics.
Floods. The flood.
Floods. Where?
Louisiana.
In Louisiana.
Wildfires
Wildfires
in California.
in California.
Water crisis in Michigan.
Water crisis in Michigan, Flint, Michigan. Okay, I'm very impressed by those three responses. Because those three responses are not referring to a class of individuals. They're referring to kind of natural events. Even the Flint, okay, it's kind of natural. Yeah, are people responsible? Yeah, they are. Okay. Are people responsible for the floods in Louisiana? Nope. Wildfires in California? Some of them, yes, because some of them were intentionally started. I've got a friend who lives very close to some of the wildfires. What else? I mean, if I was asking this question a year ago, we'd be talking about these uprisings on college campuses over slights and perceived slights. So-and-so offended me, therefore I want to ban all these people from this campus. So-and-so offended me, so I want to ban all this speech. Okay? How about sickness? Any of you know anybody who's really ill? I don't mean really ill, they've got the flu. They've got pneumonia. I mean somebody, they've got cancer. My wife was diagnosed with cancer, what year is this? 2 years ago. Okay? She's in remission or whatever. But, cancer. Or little kids who get cancer. That sucks. That's not right. Or little kids who die. Parents should never have to bury their children. Okay? What else? Taxes we could throw in.
Heart disease.
Heart disease?
Obesity problems.
Just read an account the other day of ISIS captured, 12 Christians somewhere in Iraq or Syria, and because they wouldn't convert, beheaded them. And you can see the picture of the ISIS guys and the 12 heads sitting in front of them. Okay. You think, Christians in Iraq want to escape from that? Probably. You think Yazidi women want to escape? Probably. You think those 300 schoolgirls captured by Boko Haram in Nigeria would like to get away from those blankety blanks? Probably. Okay. There's an awful lot we'd like to escape from. Those are all real big things. What about smaller, personal things? Prices of textbooks on campus. I told my earlier class, I use a particular textbook in this class because it's about the least expensive one I could find. Okay? What else? Anybody in here as fast as Usain Bolt? Yeah, I didn't think so. Anybody in here play basketball like Michael Jordan? Yeah, I didn't think so. How about our own little physical limitations? Anybody in here secretly, they like to sing, but they don't sing well. They like to draw, but they don't draw well. They like to do things, but they're not very good at it. Would you like to escape from that? Would you like to have those abilities that other people have, that it's just no fair that they have and you don't? Okay? Yeah. Those are other forms of escape that we want. Tolkien writes about. Okay? And fantasy can give us. And then he gets to this one, consolation. What does he mean? He says that essentially the true form of a fairy story is the happy ending. A true fairy story, Tolkien says, has to have this happy ending. Not the Disney happy ending. Where, Cinderella or whatever gets her Prince Charming and they ride off to the nice big magical castle in the sky. It's not what he means. He means what he calls the eucatastrophic ending. Okay? And he creates a word, the eucatastrophe. Everybody knows what a catastrophe is, right? The floods in Louisiana are a catastrophe. They're pretty bad if you live in Louisiana. Number I heard today was something like 60,000 homes underwater. Okay? That means at least 60,000 people. If you think some of those homes have 4 or more people, you're talking 250,000 people displaced. Okay? That's a catastrophe. Actually, it's not. Because this would be a catastrophe too. You go out from here, you fill up cash, you buy a lottery ticket, and you win the lotto. $250 million or whatever it is today. That would be a catastrophe. How so? Well, the word catastrophe simply means a sudden turn. Sudden change. That would be a sudden change, right? If I won the lotto, I'd probably have a heart attack because it would be such a huge change. I also probably would not be here next week. Warning you. Okay? So that's a catastrophe. So then, what's a eucatastrophe? You're familiar with this prefix in phrases or in words like eulogy or eugenics. What does eugenics mean?
It's the science of trying to create the perfect human.
Yeah. Literally, it's good genes. Okay? In case you don't know, just throw this little tidbit out there to rile you up a little bit. Margaret K. Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, she was a huge eugenics supporter. Why did she found Planned Parenthood? Yeah, but why? What were the good genes? Mine. White genes. She wanted to, quote unquote, breed African Americans or blacks out. She was a really, really nasty piece of work. Just throw that out there. So that's eugenics. Good genes. Eulogy. You go to a funeral, somebody stands up and says, sorry Fred's dead, but he was a nasty piece of shit and he deserved everything he got. I only wish I could have riddled him with bullets first. That would be not a eulogy, that would be a dislogy. Okay? D-Y-S-L-O-G-Y. Eulogy is a good word. Even if the person is the rottenest, sorriest piece of human excrement that ever lived, you would say, well, I'm really sorry that Jim died because nobody should have died like that. Okay? Eulogy, it's the good word. Okay? So a eucatastrophe is the good sudden turn. That would be you're going out buying that lotto ticket and winning. Okay? But you can also have the discatastrophe. You walk out from here, you get in your car, you're getting ready to go across the empty boulevard, bam, you get smacked by a semi-truck and you're dead. That would be a bad catastrophe. Okay? So Tolkien says the true form of the fairy story has this. But what does he mean by it? He means this is something that you can't count on to happen multiple times. He calls it a sudden grace, never to recur again. Okay? And by using the word grace, he brings in religious language. And the epilogue to the fairy story essay, he's connecting fairy stories to the Christian story, to the gospel story. He says, all fairy stories have meaning in relation to this one story, which we're not going to go into that. But we are going to talk a little bit more about this. Because he says, in order for that eucatastrophe to really have meaning, it has to occur where? Or what must the story allow for? What must there be a possibility of? Failure. Loss. He says, what this does is it shows in the face of much evidence to the contrary. Good will win. What does he mean, much evidence to the contrary?
That against all odds,
You're the last person left holding a weapon. You're the last Christian in town, and a horde of ISIS soldiers are coming at you. What are the odds looking like? Not very good. Okay? You're going to... Okay? But what he says, what the eucatastrophe does, is it says, yeah, you might die.
But what's the point of trying?
Exactly. But your cause won't die. I mean, you can look at points, throughout world history. World War II. There were numerous points that the Allies could have said, we give. We're not going to win. I mean, pretty much by December 1939, Hitler had overrun most of Europe. Things did not look good. Okay? Dunkirk in early 1940 or 41, when you had 500,000 Allied troops, evacuated from the coast of Normandy in fishing boats. Why? Because Hitler has just completely overrun all of Europe now. That's in the face of much evidence. It's then that Winston Churchill delivers his "we will never give up" speech. We'll fight them on the beaches. We'll fight them in the headlands. We'll fight them from the rooftops. We shall never surrender. Okay, he's saying that right after a huge surrender. Massive. But it's a surrender in the sense of not the Allies throwing up their hands. It's the Allies leaving Europe entirely at that point. Okay. When they leave, when the British troops and the French troops leave France at that point, they're saying to the rest of continental Europe, you're on your own. We can't help you, at least not for a while. Okay? That's in the face of much evidence to the contrary. Our cause will survive. And what Tolkien says there is that it is a fleeting glimpse of joy. Joy from where? Joy beyond the confines of this world. In other words, it's a fleeting glimpse that there is something more out there, something beyond what we normally see and perceive at work. And we're back to Boethius and the Consolation of Philosophy. And you're going to see a couple of scenes in The Lord of the Rings where it's going to look really, really, really bad. Sam and Frodo, you just think there is no way they can keep going on. And there will be a little natural occurrence, something in the weather that they will take strength from, they'll take heart from, and they'll kind of say, look, it's not all going his way, meaning Sauron's. Something else is going on, okay? And we'll see the same kind of thing in the Harry Potter novels, all right? So that's kind of a very brief overview of the fairy story essay. We're not talking about Lord of the Rings and the Harry Potter novels, however, as fairy stories. But we are going to talk about some of these kinds of elements within them, especially this one. Okay? Because Rowling, I have no idea whether or not she's read, I don't have any proof that she's read the fairy story essay. I am personally convinced that she has. Okay? She has read Lord of the Rings multiple times. She talks about it in interviews, right? But she does stuff in the novels really make me think she knows what Tolkien's talking about here in terms of recovery. Because Harry has to repeatedly learn to see. Okay? And through Harry, we as readers learn to see. We learn kind of in real time along with Harry Potter as he learns. That's what Rowling intends to happen. If you don't learn along with Harry, there's something wrong. In other words, if you identify with Voldemort, you might want to see a counselor or a priest or an exorcist, you know. One of those three. Okay, we'll stop there, unless you have questions. Yes?
What's the name of your YouTube channel?
Oh, just look up Ted Sherman. All one word. I've actually got two, Ted Sherman, Dr. Ted Sherman, but most of my stuff is on the Ted Sherman. And I've got them arranged according to playlists, and I've got multiple for the Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings. Right? If you ever miss class, you can watch one of those, or I'll probably put these up as well.